The morning of February 8, 1943, above the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Takeo Tanimisu heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It came first as a distant whistle, barely audible over the roar of his Mitsubishi Ace M0's engine. Then it grew louder, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to tear through the humid tropical air. He turned his head, searching the sky, and saw it diving from 23,000 feet. An American fighter with distinctive inverted gull wings, painted dark blue, plunging toward his formation at a speed that seemed impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The aircraft was an F4U Corsair, and in that moment, as Takeo watched it close the distance with terrifying rapidity, he understood that everything he had been taught about American inferiority was a lie. The whistle grew to a scream. The Corsair opened fire while still diving, its 650 caliber machine guns creating a stream of tracers that seemed to fill the air. Takeo broke hard left, pulling his control stick back with both hands, forcing his Zero into the kind of tight turn that had saved countless Japanese pilots in combat against American Wildcats. The Zero responded beautifully, its legendary maneuverability allowing it to pivot in the sky with an agility no other fighter could match. But the Corsair did not try to follow him through the turn. Instead, the American pilot used his tremendous speed to pull up into a near-vertical climb, converting velocity into altitude in seconds. By the time Takeo had completed his evasive maneuver and straightened out, the Corsair was already 3,000 feet above him, circling back for another pass. Takeo's wingman was gone, his aircraft had simply disintegrated under the first burst of fire, pieces of wing and fuselage tumbling toward the ocean below. This encounter, replicated thousands of times across the Pacific theater between 1943 and 1945, explains why Japanese pilots came to fear and hate the F4U Corsair more than any other American aircraft. The statistics tell part of the story. 2,140 confirmed aerial victories, an overall kill ratio of 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in air combat. But numbers alone cannot convey the psychological devastation the Corsair inflicted on Japanese naval aviation, nor the way it shattered the confidence of pilots who had begun the war believing themselves invincible. To understand why the Corsair became synonymous with terror in the minds of Japanese aviators, one must first understand what those pilots believed about themselves and their enemy in the early years of the Pacific War. Takeo Tanimisu was born in Osaka in 1921, the son of a textile merchant. He entered the Imperial Japanese Navy's flight training program in 1939 at age 18, part of a generation raised on narratives of Japanese martial supremacy and destined for service in what military leaders promised would be a short, victorious war against the Western powers. The training program was extraordinarily demanding. Of every 100 candidates who entered, perhaps 5 would earn their wings. The survivors endured physical conditioning that bordered on torture, academic instruction in navigation, meteorology, and tactics, and hundreds of hours of flight time in progressively more advanced aircraft. Those who completed the program believed, and with considerable justification, that they were among the finest combat pilots in the world. Their primary aircraft, the Mitsubishi Ace M0, seemed to confirm this belief. Introduced in 1940, the Zero possessed performance characteristics that astonished both its pilots and its opponents. Hour and a combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles, it could escort bombers farther than any other fighter of its era. But its most remarkable feature was its maneuverability. The Zero could outturn every American and British fighter then in service, a capability that proved devastatingly effective in the hands of experienced pilots. Japanese naval aviators had validated their training and their aircraft in combat over China, where they achieved victory after victory against Chinese air forces. Then came December 7, 1941, and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese carrier aircraft, led by Zero fighters, struck the American Pacific Fleet with precision and devastating effect. In the months that followed, Japanese pilots dominated the skies over the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. Allied aircraft fell in numbers that seemed to confirm every assumption about Japanese air superiority. Takeo flew his first combat mission in March 1942, escorting bombers during operations in the Netherlands East Indies. He encountered his first American fighter, a Brewster Buffalo, during that mission, and shot it down with a diving attack that the American pilot never saw coming. Over the following months, operating from bases in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, he would add 2 more confirmed kills to his record, both American F4U Wildcats. The Wildcat was a tough, rugged aircraft, and American pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to counter the Zero's superiority in turning combat. They fought in pairs, using diving attacks to strike quickly before climbing away, refusing to engage in the turning fights where Japanese pilots excelled. These tactics, known as boom and zoom, were prudent and effective when executed with discipline. But the Wildcat possessed limitations that Japanese pilots learned to exploit. It was slower than the Zero, climbed more slowly, and lacked the range for extended combat. When a Wildcat dove away to escape, a Zero pilot could simply climb to altitude and wait. Eventually, limited by fuel, the American would have to break off and return to base, and if the Japanese pilot had patience and altitude advantage, he could intercept that return. By mid-1942, Takeo and his fellow pilots at Rabaul, the major Japanese airbase in the South Pacific, operated with considerable confidence. The war was not going quite as promised. American forces had held at Midway and were showing unexpected resilience in the Solomons. But in the air, Japanese pilots still felt they possessed the advantage. Their aircraft was superior, their training more thorough, their combat experience more extensive. Then, in February 1943, reports began filtering through Rabaul of a new American fighter. Pilots who had encountered it returned shaken, if they returned at all. The aircraft was massive, they said, with bent wings that gave it a distinctive silhouette. It was powered by an engine so large that the entire aircraft seemed to vibrate with contained power. Most disturbing of all, it was faster than anything Japanese pilots had encountered, faster even than some Japanese bombers flying at maximum speed. One pilot, a veteran named Warrant Officer Saito with 11 confirmed victories, described attempting to escape one of these new fighters by diving, the standard tactic against Wildcats. The American had not only followed but had actually overtaken him in the dive, pulling alongside as if to mock his attempt at escape before opening fire and nearly shooting him out of the sky. Only a combination of desperate maneuvering and sheer luck had allowed Saito to survive long enough for the American to break off. Takeo listened to these accounts with a mixture of skepticism and unease. Combat conditions created stress, and stress created distortions in perception and memory. Pilots exaggerated under fire. It was a known phenomenon. Moreover, the narrative seemed inconsistent with everything Takeo understood about American industrial capabilities. The United States had been at war for only 14 months. How could they have designed, tested, and deployed a fighter that represented such a dramatic leap beyond the Wildcat? In April 1943, Takeo attended a briefing where the intelligence officer distributed a captured American document, a technical manual for the F4U Corsair. The specifications detailed in that manual seemed to belong to a different category of aircraft entirely. Maximum speed, 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet, 2,890 feet per minute. Service ceiling, 36,900 feet. Armament, 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. The intelligence officer, a lieutenant commander who had studied engineering before the war, explained what these figures meant in practical terms. The Corsair's speed advantage over the Zero was 86 miles per hour, a margin so large that the American pilot could dictate the terms of every engagement. If he wanted to fight, he could close to firing range before the Zero could escape. If he wanted to disengage, he could simply dive away or climb away, and no Zero could follow. The rate of climb meant that any altitude advantage the Japanese pilot gained could be negated within minutes. The service ceiling meant the Corsair could fight effectively at altitudes where the Zero's performance began to degrade. Someone in the briefing room asked the obvious question, "How do we counter this aircraft?" The intelligence officer looked down at his notes for several seconds before responding. "We are developing tactical recommendations. For now, avoid engagement when possible. If engagement is unavoidable, attack with numerical superiority and break contact immediately, after the first pass." The phrasing was careful, almost bureaucratic, but every experienced pilot in the room understood what it meant. They had no answer. The Corsair represented a level of performance that existing Japanese tactics could not effectively counter. Takeo's first direct encounter with a Corsair came on June 14, 1943. His Squadron 8 Ceros was providing escort for a formation of Mitsubishi Guatrum bombers attacking American positions on New Georgia. They flew at 18,000 feet in the clear morning air, visibility extending for miles in every direction. Takeo maintained his position on the squadron leader's right wing, scanning the sky in constant sweeps. American fighters typically attacked from high altitude, diving from the sun where their approach would be difficult to detect. The warning came from his wingman. "High. 3 o'clock high." Takeo looked up and to the right. There, perhaps 5,000 feet above the formation, were 3 aircraft in a loose echelon. Even at distance, the inverted gull wings marked them as Corsairs. They were positioned perfectly for a diving attack, and as Takeo watched, they rolled over and began their descent. The squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio. "Brake on my signal. 3, 2, 1 brake." Takeo rolled left and pulled hard, forcing his Zero into a turn that would have stalled any heavier aircraft. The G-forces crushed him into his seat, narrowing his vision. He heard the sound, that distinctive whistle growing louder as the Corsairs accelerated in their dive. Then came the hammer blow staccato of heavy machine guns. The first Corsair opened fire while still 1,000 feet away and closing rapidly. American pilots had learned to compensate for deflection angle and target movement even at high speeds. Their gunnery was not only accurate, but demonstrated a confidence that came from knowing their aircraft's advantages. Tracers bright orange in the morning. Sunlight streamed past Takeo's canopy. He tightened his turn, pulling until his vision narrowed to a tunnel, forcing his Zero through a maneuver that should have left the pursuing fighter behind. The Corsair did not attempt to follow through the turn. Takeo, leveling out and checking his 6 o'clock position, saw the American aircraft pulling up from its dive, converting speed into altitude in a climbing turn that carried it back above the Japanese formation within seconds. The maneuver should have been impossible, the energy state required to both pull out of a high-speed dive and climb 2,000 feet, while turning should have left the aircraft slow and vulnerable. But the Corsair's massive Pratt Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, made it possible. Takeo looked around for his wingman. The other Zero was gone. Later, squadron records would list the pilot as missing in action, but Takeo had seen enough combat to know what that meant. The Corsair's first burst had found its target. He attempted to climb, trying to regain altitude advantage, but his Zero's rate of climb, 2,658 feet per minute, could not match the Corsair's. The American was already above him, positioning for another pass. Takeo dove, the only option remaining. He pushed his stick forward and opened his throttle fully, picking up speed as the altimeter unwound. At 4,000 feet, he pulled up hard and deployed his flaps, forcing the Zero into a near stall that would cause any pursuing aircraft to overshoot. The Corsair shot past him, but not out of control, not struggling. The American pilot had anticipated the maneuver and had already begun his pull-up, using his excess speed to climb 3,000 feet above Takeo's position. The Zero, now slow and low, was defenseless. Takeo's engine was at maximum power, but acceleration was agonizingly gradual. The Corsair dove again. This time, Takeo saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the guns. 6 50 caliber machine guns, each firing at a rate of 750 rounds per minute, created a cone of fire that was less a stream of individual bullets and more a continuous force. His Zero shuddered as rounds struck home sharp metallic cracks that he could feel through the airframe. The canopy starred where a bullet passed close enough to his head that he felt the shock wave. Smoke began pouring from his engine cowling. Then another Zero, one of the squadron's veterans, slashed across the Corsair's attack angle, forcing the American to break off. The Corsair rolled away, not in panic or defeat, but with the casual ease of a pilot who knew he could re-engage whenever he chose. Within seconds, it had climbed back to 15,000 feet, outside the range where Takeo's damaged aircraft posed any threat. Takeo nursed his dying fighter back toward Rabaul, the engine running rough, temperature gauges climbing into the red. He landed, with minimal hydraulic pressure, the engine producing more smoke than thrust. Ground crew counted 37 bullet holes in the airframe. One round had passed through the fuselage less than 18 inches from where Takeo sat. That night, lying in his quarters, Takeo could not stop thinking about the engagement. Every tactical assumption he had been taught, every principle that had kept him alive through 15 months of combat, had proven inadequate against the Corsair. The Zero's maneuverability advantage was meaningless when the enemy refused to turn fight. Superior pilot skill could not overcome an 86 mph speed disadvantage. Fighting spirit, the quality that Japanese training emphasized above all else, offered no protection against 6 heavy machine guns, firing 225 rounds per second combined. Over the following weeks, Takeo flew 16 more missions. He encountered Corsairs on 7 of those missions. Each engagement followed the same pattern. The Americans would dive from altitude, use their speed advantage to dictate positioning, and attack with devastating firepower. If a Zero attempted to turn fight, the Corsair pilot would simply disengage, climb back to altitude, using energy the Zero could not match, and attack again. If a Zero tried to escape by diving the tactic that had worked against Wildcats, the Corsair would follow and often overtake. The squadron's loss rate became unsustainable. In the 3 months following Takeo's first Corsair encounter, 22 pilots were killed or missing. The mathematics of attrition were straightforward and terrible. At current rates, the squadron would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 6 months. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Times. Psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical losses. Japanese military culture emphasized the warrior spirit, the belief that dedication, courage, and proper attitude could overcome material disadvantages. This philosophy had deep roots in Japanese history and had been reinforced by victory after victory in the early war years. But the Corsair shattered that belief through the simple mechanism of repeatedly demonstrating that courage was insufficient. A veteran named Lieutenant Ito, who had flown since the attack on Pearl Harbor and possessed 14 confirmed kills, refused to fly after his 3rd Corsair engagement. He simply sat in the ready room, staring at nothing, until the squadron commander had him evacuated to Japan for psychiatric evaluation. Another pilot, Warrant Officer Matsuda, went the opposite direction, becoming increasingly reckless in an attempt to prove that fighting spirit could triumph over technology. He lasted 3 more missions before a Corsair caught him during a bombing run on American positions. Witnesses reported that Matsuda had tried to turn fight with the American, a decision born of desperation rather than tactics. His Zero had exploded under sustained fire, pieces of the aircraft scattering across 200 yards of ocean. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing Corsairs at a rate that seemed impossible to Japanese intelligence analysts. Chance Vote, the primary manufacturer, along with Goodyear and Brewster Aeronautical, were producing over 500 aircraft per month by mid-1943. These weren't prototypes or experimental models, but fully combat-capable aircraft with standardized parts, maintenance procedures, and training programs. Japanese industry, already strained by the demands of a multi-front war, could not come close to matching this output. Zero production peaked at 320 aircraft per month, and even that rate could not be sustained as raw materials became scarce and experienced factory workers were conscripted for military service. In September 1943, Takeo was summoned to a special briefing along with the squadron's most experienced pilots. The intelligence officer, a different man now. The previous one had been killed during a bombing raid, presented an analysis of American naval aviation capabilities based on captured documents and reconnaissance reports. The Corsair, he explained, had been specifically designed for carrier operations. The inverted gull wing design, which had seemed strange to Japanese pilots, served a crucial practical purpose. It allowed the massive propeller to clear the deck, while keeping the landing gear relatively short and strong. The wing folded upward for compact storage aboard carriers, allowing more aircraft to be packed into limited hangar space. What this meant, the intelligence officer continued, was that Japanese forces would soon face Corsairs, not just from land bases, but from the American carrier fleet as well. The implications were profound. Carrier-based Corsairs could provide air superiority anywhere in the Pacific, allowing American naval forces to operate with relative impunity. Japanese aircraft carriers, meanwhile, were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, and pilot losses had created a training crisis that could not be overcome. After the briefing, Takeo walked along the airfield perimeter, watching ground crews perform maintenance on the remaining Zeros. The aircraft looked fragile in the tropical sunlight, their thin aluminum skin barely concealing the delicate framework underneath. They had been designed for a specific tactical philosophy: maximum performance through minimal weight, achieved by eliminating armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and other safety features. When that philosophy had been developed in the late 1930s, it had seemed reasonable. Japanese pilots would be so superior that they would never be hit. The Corsair had revealed that assumption as fatal hubris. In October 1943, Takeo received orders transferring him temporarily to Truk Atoll for what was described as advanced tactical training. The program, he discovered upon arrival, was actually an attempt by Naval Aviation Command to develop effective counter-tactics against the Corsair. 12 experienced pilots from various units had been assembled to test different approaches: high-altitude interception, coordinated attacks from multiple angles, night operations, anything that might offset the American aircraft's performance advantages. The training officer, a commander who had flown in China and at Midway, was blunt about the situation. "Gentlemen, you are here because you have survived multiple encounters with the Corsair. That makes you valuable, not because you have discovered how to defeat it, but because you know what does not work. Our task is to determine if anything does work." For 3 weeks, they flew training missions against a captured Corsair that had been forced down relatively intact near Guadalcanal and subsequently repaired by Japanese technicians. The experience was educational in the most demoralizing way possible. Even with advanced knowledge of the Corsair's position, altitude, and heading advantages they would never possess in actual combat, the Zero pilots struggled to achieve favorable engagements. The Corsair's speed allowed it to dictate every aspect of the encounter. When Japanese pilots attempted to use numbers to overwhelm it, the Corsair simply dove away, extended the distance, then climbed back to altitude beyond their reach. The most successful tactic they developed was desperately simple: attack once from a position of significant altitude advantage, then immediately disengage and run. Do not attempt a second pass. Do not try to confirm the kill. Strike and flee. This was the advice that would be disseminated to frontline units, the accumulated wisdom of Japan's most experienced pilots, reduced to a doctrine of survival rather than victory. Takeo returned to Rabaul in November 1943. The base had changed during his absence. More aircraft were dispersed in revetments, camouflage netting was more extensive, and the anti-aircraft positions had been reinforced. These were the preparations of a force expecting sustained attack. American bombing raids had increased in both frequency and intensity, and Corsairs now provided escort for the bombers, making interception extremely costly. The squadron had received replacements, while he was gone 7 new pilots, their average age 19, their average flight time less than 200 hours. Before the war, a pilot required at least 500 hours before being considered combat ready. These boys, Takeo realized, were being sent to die. They did not have the experience to survive even against wildcats, let alone Corsairs. But Japan no longer had the fuel, the aircraft, or the time to train pilots properly. The attrition rate demanded bodies in cockpits, regardless of preparation. On November 23, 1943, Takeo flew what would be his final large-scale engagement against Corsairs. Intelligence had detected a major American bomber strike being prepared against Rabaul, potentially dozens of aircraft that would target the harbor facilities and airfield infrastructure. Every available fighter was ordered to intercept. Takeo's squadron, now numbering 14 aircraft including the replacements, took off at dawn. They climbed to 23,000 feet and positioned themselves along the expected approach route. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, the kind of conditions that should favor defenders. Takeo flew with his usual wingman, one of the few surviving veterans, while the new pilots clustered together in a second group, their formation loose and uncertain. The bombers appeared exactly on schedule, a formation of B-24 Liberators, flying at 20,000 feet, their contrails visible for miles. The squadron leader gave the signal to attack. Standard doctrine called for a diving approach from above and behind, targeting the bombers before they could reach their objective. Takeo rolled into his attack run, picking up speed in the dive. The Liberators tightened their formation, their gunners preparing to create overlapping fields of fire. This was the deadly calculus of bomber interception. The attacking fighters had perhaps 30 seconds to close range, fire, and break away before defensive guns tore them apart. But in those 30 seconds, properly executed, a skilled pilot could destroy or cripple a bomber worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and carrying 10 trained crew members. Then the Corsairs appeared. There were 8 of them, and they had been waiting at 28,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the Japanese fighters, hidden by the glare of the morning sun. They dove as a coordinated unit, their attack timed to catch the Zeros at their most vulnerable moment, committed to the bomber attack, unable to maneuver defensively without abandoning their approach. The first indication Takeo had of their presence was the whistle, that sound which had become synonymous with imminent death, and the sight of tracers cutting through the formation ahead of him. 3 Zeros exploded almost simultaneously, hit by concentrated fire from multiple Corsairs. The Americans' gunnery was not merely accurate, but demonstrated a level of fire discipline and coordination that came from extensive training and combat experience. Takeo broke hard right, abandoning his bomber attack. Survival took precedence over mission objectives. He saw his wingman break left, separating their defensive maneuvers to force any pursuing Corsair to choose a single target. Standard tactics, but these were not standard circumstances. A Corsair was already positioned on Takeo's right quarter, having anticipated his break direction. The American pilot did not fire immediately. He was maneuvering to achieve an optimal firing position, confident that his aircraft's performance gave him time to be precise. Takeo reversed his turn, pulling so hard that his vision grayed at the edges. The G-forces crushed him into his seat, his flight suit's pressure constricting around his legs to prevent blood from pooling away from his brain. The Zero responded to his inputs with its characteristic agility, pivoting through space in a turn radius no other fighter could match. For a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, Takeo felt the old confidence return. This was what Zeros were built for, what Japanese pilots trained for. Turn fighting required skill, instinct, the kind of aerial mastery that could not be taught through manuals. But the Corsair pilot was not trying to turn with him. Instead of following through Takeo's reversal, the American used his superior speed to extend the distance, then climbed. Simpler physics. Energy could be converted between speed and altitude, and the Corsair had energy to spare. Within 15 seconds, the American was 3,000 feet above Takeo's position, circling back for another attack. Takeo looked around desperately for his wingman. The other Zero was gone. He caught a glimpse of smoke trail arsing down toward the ocean. Around him, the sky had become a chaotic melee, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Corsairs were systematically destroying the Japanese formation, one fighter at a time, while the bombers continued unmolested toward their target. He counted remaining aircraft in the brief seconds available. 5 Ceros still flying. 8 Corsairs. 14 Japanese fighters had engaged, and 9 were already destroyed or so damaged they had broken off. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 3 minutes. The Corsair dove on him again. This time Takeo did not attempt to maneuver. He simply pushed his stick forward, diving as steeply as he dared, trying to build enough speed to escape. The Zero shuddered as it accelerated past its recommended maximum velocity. His engine screamed with strain. The altimeter unwound rapidly 20,000 feet, 18,000, 15,000. The whistle grew louder. The Corsair was following, and it was gaining. At 10,000 feet, Takeo pulled up hard, hoping the sudden change in direction would cause the American to overshoot. Bullets hit his aircraft before he could complete the maneuver, a burst that stitched across his left wing and fuselage. He felt the impacts as physical blows transmitted through the airframe. His control stick went mushy. The elevator cables had been damaged, but the Corsair was breaking off, climbing away. Takeo saw another Zero diving on the American from above one of the new pilots, making a desperate attempt to save him. The Corsair evaded easily, rolling inverted and pulling through, then reversing to get on the young pilot's tail. The engagement lasted perhaps 20 seconds. The Zero disintegrated under sustained fire, its fuel tanks igniting in a fireball that scattered burning debris across a quarter-mile of sky. Takeo wrestled his damaged aircraft toward Rabaul, flying barely above stall speed, nursing an engine that was rapidly destroying itself. He landed with no hydraulic pressure, his landing gear deployed only because of backup systems, his left wing trailing smoke. As he climbed out of the cockpit, his legs failed, and he collapsed onto the wing. Ground crew helped him down, their faces grim. The mission report, filed later that day, recorded the engagement's outcome with bureaucratic precision. 14 Japanese fighters engaged, 9 destroyed, 3 damaged beyond repair, 2 damaged but repairable. 0 bombers destroyed. The American bomber formation had struck its targets without interference, cratering the airfield's main runway and destroying 2 large fuel storage tanks. For this, Japan had lost 12 aircraft and 9 experienced pilots in exchange for no confirmed kills. The mathematics of attrition had become impossible to ignore. At these loss rates, Japanese naval aviation in the South Pacific would cease to exist as an effective force within months, and the Americans, with their overwhelming industrial capacity, could replace every lost Corsair with 3 more, every lost pilot with 5 more graduates from their sprawling training programs. That night, Takeo sat in his quarters with a notebook and did calculations he knew he should not commit to paper. He had been in theater for 11 months. In that time, he had flown 81 combat missions. Of the 32 pilots who had been in the squadron when he arrived, 27 were dead. 20 of those had died in combat with Corsairs. He wrote down more numbers, data he had, accumulated from reports and briefings. The Americans were producing Corsairs at over 500 per month. They were training pilots at a rate of 10,000 per year. They had 17 carriers in the Pacific, with more under construction. Japan had 4 operational carriers, and the pilot training program was graduating perhaps 1,000 aviators annually, a rate that did not even replace combat losses. But the numbers that haunted Takeo most were the kill ratios. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 215, operating from Munda, had claimed over 100 victories against 3 losses. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron led by Major Gregory Boyington, would eventually claim 94 confirmed kills in just 84 days of combat. These were not anomalies but representative examples of Corsair performance across the theatre. How did you fight an enemy with those kinds of statistics? The question had no answer, and Takeo was beginning to understand that there was no answer. Japan had committed to war against a nation whose industrial capacity was so overwhelming that individual courage, superior training, and tactical brilliance became irrelevant. The Americans did not need to be better pilots, though many were excellent. They only needed to be adequate, because their aircraft would compensate for any deficiency. In December 1943, Takeo was ordered back to Japan on medical leave. The strain of continuous combat had reduced him to 123 pounds, 40 pounds below his normal weight. His hands had developed a constant tremor. He suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1943 the condition had no formal name and little effective treatment. In Tokyo, he met with a technical officer who specialized in analyzing captured enemy equipment. The officer had access to components from a Corsair that had been forced down largely intact, and he walked Takeo through the aircraft's construction with an engineer's appreciation for elegant design. "The engine alone weighs more than your entire Zero," the officer explained, showing photographs of the Pratt Whitney 2800 double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. The Americans have developed metallurgical techniques that allow them to build engines of this power density. We do not possess these techniques. He showed Takeo more photographs. The Corsair's armor plating, which protected the pilot and critical systems. The self-sealing fuel tanks, lined with rubber that swelled when punctured by bullets, automatically closing small holes before significant fuel loss occurred. The robust construction that allowed the airframe to absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying. American design philosophy treats pilots as valuable resources to be protected, the officer continued. They build aircraft. Accordingly, our philosophy has prioritized performance over protection, assuming that pilot skill would prevent hits. That assumption has proven problematic. Takeo thought about the 19-year-old replacement pilots now arriving at forward bases with minimal training, expected to face American veterans flying aircraft that outclassed Japanese fighters in every measurable performance category. That assumption was catastrophically wrong, he said quietly. The officer looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. What Takeo learned during his month in Japan transformed his understanding not just of the Corsair, but of the entire war. The F4U was not simply a superior fighter aircraft. It was a symbol of American industrial and technological capacity that Japan could never match. Every Corsair represented not just the aircraft itself, but the entire system that produced it. The aluminum refineries processing bauxite into high-grade metal, the precision manufacturing facilities building thousands of identical components, the trained workers operating advanced machinery, the oil refineries producing high-octane aviation fuel, the training programs producing competent pilots at industrial scale. The Japanese had entered the war believing that fighting spirit Bushido could overcome material disadvantages. The Corsair proved them wrong in the most brutal way possible. An average American pilot in a Corsair could defeat an experienced Japanese pilot in a Zero, simply because the aircraft's performance margins were that overwhelming. Speed, firepower, durability, rate of climb, every measurable advantage belonged to the American aircraft. By the end of 1943, Corsairs had accumulated over 1,000 confirmed kills. That number would eventually reach 2,140 by war's end. The 11-to-1 kill ratio stood as mathematical proof of how completely the Corsair dominated its opponents. Some individual squadrons achieved even more remarkable records. Marine VMF 312 claimed 106 aerial victories without a single air-to-air loss. Japanese pilots developed multiple names for the aircraft, each reflecting their fear and respect. Whistling Death, named for the distinctive sound the air intakes made at high speed. Ghost Plane, because it seemed to appear and disappear at will, striking with devastating force before climbing beyond reach. Official intelligence documents called it Enemy Type F, but every pilot knew what that antiseptic designation represented. An encounter you would probably not survive. Takeo returned to combat duty in January 1944, assigned to a training unit in Japan, where he attempted to prepare new pilots for the reality they would face in the Pacific. He emphasized speed over maneuverability, altitude advantage over aggressive pursuit, survival over glory. Many of the students looked at him with disappointment, having expected lessons in Bushido and warrior spirit. He tried to explain that fighting spirit meant nothing against an aircraft that could outrun you, outclimb you, and destroy you with overwhelming firepower. Most did not understand until they reached combat units. In July 1944, during a training flight, Takeo's aircraft developed engine problems at low altitude. He attempted an emergency landing but misjudged his approach in conditions of limited visibility. The Zero struck trees short of the runway, and though Takeo survived, his injuries were severe enough to end his combat flying career. He spent the remainder of the war at administrative posts, watching Japan's aerial defenses crumble as American forces advanced across the Pacific. The final statistics told the story with brutal clarity. The F4U Corsair achieved an overall kill ratio of 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in air-to-air combat. It was credited with 2,140 confirmed aerial victories during World War II, making it one of the most successful fighters of the entire conflict. Some squadrons achieved ratios approaching 20-1. These were not propaganda figures but verified results from mission reports and gun camera footage. But beyond the statistics was a deeper truth about what the Corsair represented. For Japanese pilots who had begun the war confident in their superiority, who had been raised on narratives of martial excellence, triumphing over material advantage, the Corsair delivered a lesson in industrial reality. Courage could not compensate for an 86-mile-per-hour speed disadvantage. Skill could not overcome 650 caliber machine guns firing 225 rounds per second. Training could not bridge the gap when the enemy could produce 5 pilots for every one you graduated, 5 aircraft for every one you manufactured. The Corsair, we proved that modern warfare had become an industrial enterprise where production capacity mattered more than individual heroism. The Americans did not need to be better warriors. They only needed to be competent because their industrial system would provide them with weapons so superior that competence was sufficient. Japan had committed to war against a nation that produced more steel in 1 month than Japan produced in a year, that refined more oil in a week than Japan refined in a month, that could manufacture aircraft at rates that seemed impossible to Japanese planners accustomed to peacetime production schedules. Every engagement with a Corsair drove home this lesson. The whistle became the sound of inevitable defeat, the audible reminder that Japan had challenged an enemy whose industrial might they had catastrophically underestimated. Those 2,140 kills and that 11-1 ratio were not just numbers. They were the price of strategic miscalculation, paid in the lives of young men who discovered too late that spirit and dedication were insufficient. After the war, Takeo worked as a commercial pilot for Japan Airlines, flying routes that sometimes took him to American cities where those Corsairs had been built, Hartford, Connecticut, where Chance Vought had its main production facility. He lived until 1997, long enough to see former enemies become allies, long enough to watch Japan rebuild into an economic power. In interviews during his later years, he spoke with striking candor about his wartime experiences. When asked about the Corsair, his response was consistent. That aircraft taught me the war was lost, not because we lacked courage, our pilots were as brave as any in history, but because we were fighting an enemy who could replace every loss with 3 more aircraft, who could train pilots faster than we could shoot them down, who could build weapons we had no hope of matching. Other Japanese veterans expressed similar sentiments. Saburo Sakai, Japan's 3rd highest scoring ace who survived the war with 64 confirmed kills, wrote in his memoir, "The Corsair was the finest fighter of the war. When we heard that distinctive whistle, we knew we were in for the fight of our lives and that we would probably lose." The psychological impact of the Corsair on Japanese naval aviation cannot be separated from its tactical dominance. It transformed aerial combat from a contest of skill to a brutal equation where one side possessed overwhelming advantages in every category that mattered. Pilots who had been confident, even arrogant, in 1942 became fatalistic by 1944. The sound of that high-pitched whistle, caused by air rushing through the distinctive wing root intakes at high speed, became synonymous with death. American pilots recognized this fear and sometimes exploited it deliberately. Effect: using psychological warfare as effectively as their guns. Reports from Pacific operations describe Japanese pilots breaking formation and fleeing at the first sight of Corsair silhouettes before any shots had been fired. This was the ultimate measure of the Corsairs' dominance. It won engagements through reputation before combat even began. By war's end, the Corsair had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter in the Pacific theater. Its 2,140 confirmed kills exceeded even the legendary P-51 Mustang's totals in that region. The 11-to-1 kill ratio stood as the highest of any major American fighter type. These statistics were not merely impressive, they represented the complete obsolescence of Japanese air power in the face of American technological and industrial superiority. The F4U Corsair remains a symbol of how World War II was decided not primarily by strategy or tactics, but by industrial capacity and technological innovation. For Japanese pilots like Takeo Tanimizu, it represented a devastating truth. The enemy they had been taught to view as soft and materialistic had produced a weapon system they simply could not counter. Every advantage Japanese pilots once possessed, maneuverability, experience, dedication to service, became irrelevant when facing an aircraft that was faster, tougher, more heavily armed, and produced in numbers that seemed limitless. The whistle of a diving Corsair became the sound of that realization, the audible manifestation of a strategic miscalculation whose consequences were measured in thousands of lives. Those young men who climbed into their Zeros, knowing they faced Corsairs, understood, in the final moments before combat, that courage was not enough. The Americans had not just built a better fighter, they had built an entire system of war, industrial, technological, logistical, that Japan could never match. That was why Japanese pilots hated the Corsair more than any other fighter. It killed them, yes, but it also killed the ideology they had been raised to believe. The 2,140 victories and the 11-to-1 kill ratio were not just statistics. They were the death toll of a lie, the lie that fighting spirit could overcome material reality, that individual excellence could compensate for systemic disadvantage, that Japan could win a war against an enemy whose industrial capacity outmatched theirs by orders of magnitude. The Corsair proved that lie false, one engagement at a time, one pilot at a time, until even the most dedicated warriors understood the truth. And that truth, that they were fighting an unwinnable war against an unstoppable force, was more terrifying than death itself. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.